I didn't know that the night everyone was smiling at me was actually the night they'd already decided to erase me. If you had walked into the room that evening, you would have thought I was lucky. Crystal glasses catching warm light, white roses everywhere. A long table filled with people laughing too easily. My name written in gold on the place cards. My birthday. It looked like celebration. It sounded like love. But there's a strange thing about moments like that. Sometimes, the more perfect everything looks, the closer you are to losing everything. And I was sitting right in the center of it, smiling, unaware, already standing on the edge. 3 days before the dinner, I felt it for the first time. Not fear exactly. More like a quiet warning. The kind your body understands before your mind is ready to admit it. The house was unusually still that morning. Sunlight slid across the polished kitchen counters, and the coffee machine hummed softly, the only sound in the room. I padded in barefoot, still half asleep, reaching for a mug. That's when I saw her. Evelyn Whitmore. My mother-in-law sat at the table with her back straight, glasses perched neatly on her nose, a stack of papers arranged with surgical precision. She was writing with a red pen, marking something carefully, deliberately, like she always did. Each stroke felt final, permanent. I hesitated in the doorway. Evelyn didn't look up right away. When she did, it was too fast, like she'd been waiting. "Oh," she said pleasantly, gathering the papers in one smooth motion. She slid them into a pale lavender envelope and closed it with practiced calm. "You're up early." Something about the envelope caught my attention. It was too pretty. Thick paper, subtle embossing, not work documents. "Those look official," I said lightly, forcing my voice to stay casual even as something tightened in my chest. Her fingers paused, just for half a second, before she smiled. "Just some foundation matters," she said smoothly. "Boring things." She tucked the envelope into her handbag and stood up, already dismissing the moment, already moving past me. But the chills stayed. It crept up my spine, settled in my stomach. I watched her reflection in the kitchen window as she walked away, heels clicking softly against the floor, each step precise, controlled. For the first time since I married into this family, I felt something I couldn't explain, like I'd just glimpsed the edge of a trap and realized too late that I was already standing inside it. I'd spent most of my adult life learning how to exist between worlds. At 34, I worked as a guest relations supervisor at a boutique hotel in Charleston. To guests, I was confident, capable, the woman who fixed problems before they became complaints. But inside the Whitmore home, I was something else entirely. I was the wife who married in, the woman without the right background, the one whose accomplishments were always explained away. Evelyn liked to introduce me as Lena. She works in hospitality, as if that sentence ended with an invisible apology. At family dinners, the conversations floated above me like clouds I wasn't meant to touch. Corporate boards, private equity, foundations with last names carved into buildings. When someone asked what I did, Evelyn usually answered for me. "She's still figuring things out," she'd say kindly, "but she's very sweet." My husband, Nathan, never contradicted her. He'd squeeze my hand under the table, a small, quiet gesture meant to feel supportive, meant to replace the words he never said out loud. It didn't. That night at dinner, the usual pattern played out. Evelyn raised her glass, smiling warmly. "Lena, have you ever considered going back to school? A proper degree could really open doors." The words were wrapped in warmth, but they sliced clean. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Nathan stared at his plate, suddenly fascinated by it. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, swallowing more than just food. Later, standing alone by the sink, washing dishes long after everyone had gone to bed, I caught my reflection in the dark glass. I looked tired, not physically, but emotionally worn thin, older than I remembered being. That was the night I realized I'd been shrinking for years and calling it peace. 2 days before my birthday, Evelyn's mood shifted. She hummed while arranging table linens, smiled while coordinating flowers, spoke with a softness that felt rehearsed, almost practiced. "This year will be unforgettable," she said, sealing the lavender envelope with a firm press of her thumb. I smiled back, confusion slowly warming into cautious hope. Maybe things were changing. Maybe I'd been wrong about her. That evening, I called Nathan from work. "Your mom's being nice." I laughed softly. "Should I be worried?" He sounded distracted. "She's planning something special for you. Just trust me. Trust. The word landed heavier than it should have. I wanted to, but Nathan had changed, too. He started taking calls in the hallway, lowering his voice, smiling too quickly when I entered the room, like someone caught mid-thought. His phone lit up late at night with messages he never explained. Once, I caught a glimpse, a single heart emoji, before he turned the screen away. "Work?" I asked gently, already knowing that wasn't the truth. "You'll see," he said, kissing my forehead. "It's a surprise." My chest tightened. Nathan had never been good at secrets. Now everything about him felt rehearsed, careful. The night before the dinner, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting a navy dress I'd chosen carefully. Elegant, safe, approved. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was the one she used when she needed to survive. Behind me, the bedroom glowed softly. My wedding ring lay on the dresser, my life reduced to neat little symbols. "Just get through tomorrow," I whispered. I didn't know I was asking myself to walk into a storm. Nathan came home late, smelling faintly of rain and cologne. He wrapped his arms around me without warning. I froze, then relaxed into him out of habit. "I love you," he said quietly. Something about his voice felt final. "Tomorrow," he added, "you'll remember forever." I let out a weak laugh. "That's ominous." He smiled, but his eyes didn't. That night, sleep never came. Only the sound of the wind brushing against the windows, like the world itself was holding its breath. The dinner was perfect. Too perfect. Candlelight, soft music, familiar faces smiling at me like everything was normal. Evelyn sat beside me, radiant and composed. Nathan across the table, checking his phone again and again. "This will be a night to remember," Evelyn said sweetly. I lifted my glass, steadying my hands. I didn't know it yet, but this wasn't a celebration. It was a farewell, and the gift waiting for me had already been sealed. There's a particular kind of kindness that feels wrong. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand anything. It just lingers, watching. That was Evelyn, the day of my birthday dinner. She floated through the house like a woman at peace, humming softly as she adjusted place settings, smoothing tablecloths that were already perfect. Every detail was controlled, curated, intentional, and I was the only one who felt like something underneath it all was sharp. "You look beautiful," she said when she saw me come downstairs. Her eyes scanned me slowly, from my earrings to my shoes. "That color suits you," I smiled. "Thank you." It should have felt like approval. Instead, it felt like confirmation. By late afternoon, the house filled with movement. Caterers arrived. Flowers were carried in. Wine bottles lined the counter like silent witnesses. Nathan hovered more than usual, touching my arm, fixing invisible creases in my dress, smiling at me like he was memorizing my face. "You okay?" he asked softly. "Just nervous," I said. He nodded, as if that made sense, as if this night wasn't about me at all. Right before guests arrived, I stepped into the bathroom and locked the door. I leaned against the sink and stared at myself. Why do I feel like I'm about to be fired from my own life? My phone buzzed. "Mara," I answered immediately. "Tell me I'm being dramatic," I said before she could speak. She paused. I could hear city noise behind her, a car horn, footsteps. "Okay," she said carefully. "What happened?" I told her everything. The envelope, the sudden kindness, Nathan's secrecy, that sick feeling in my chest that wouldn't go away. When I finished, she sighed. "Listen to me," she said. "People don't become gentle out of nowhere. They become gentle when they've already made their decision." My throat tightened. "So what do I do?" "Whatever happens," she said firmly, "don't beg, don't explain yourself, and don't let them see you panic." I closed my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. When I hung up, the bathroom felt quieter than before. Not peaceful, prepared. The Magnolia Room at the restaurant glowed exactly the way magazines promise happiness should look. Soft, amber lights, white roses spilling over crystal vases, linen napkins folded with precision. Everything smelled like money and restraint. I took my seat at the long table, smiling as guests greeted me. "Happy birthday! You look stunning. This place is gorgeous." Evelyn sat to my right, composed as ever. Nathan across from me, his phone face down, but never far from his hand. As people settled in, I noticed small things. Evelyn kept glancing at her purse. Nathan checked the time repeatedly. His sister whispered something to him, and they both looked at me. The feeling in my chest returned. Louder now. Still, I lifted my glass when someone proposed a toast. If they wanted a performance, I would give them grace. Dinner was served. I barely tasted it. Conversations swirled around me, but I felt like I was underwater, catching only fragments. Foundation donors? Merger finalized? Perfect timing, perfect timing. Evelyn dabbed her lips with a napkin and smiled at me. Lena, darling, she said warmly. Before dessert, I'd like to say something. The table quieted. My heartbeat slowed in a strange way, like my body already knew what was coming. She stood slowly, smoothing her dress, every movement deliberate. You've been part of this family for a while now, she began, and birthdays are a time for reflection, for honesty. I glanced at Nathan. He didn't look back. Instead, he picked up his phone. The red recording light blinked on. I noticed it immediately. The camera pointed at me, my reflection glowing faintly on the screen. Evelyn, I said softly, unsure why my voice sounded so calm. What's this? She smiled wider. A gift, she said, reaching into her purse. The lavender envelope appeared between her fingers, catching the light like it was proud of itself. My chest hollowed. She placed it in front of me, right beside my untouched glass of wine. Go on, she said gently. Open it. The room was silent now. No clinking glasses, no music, just the soft hum of expectation. Nathan's phone stayed trained on my face, recording, waiting. For a moment, I didn't move. I looked around the table, at the people who had eaten my food, who had smiled at me, who were now holding their breath like this was entertainment. I slid my finger under the flap. The paper tore softly. A camera flash went off somewhere. Inside the envelope were crisp white pages, legal language, signatures, a law firm's seal, divorce papers. The world didn't explode. It simply went quiet. I stared at the words, my mind floating somewhere above the table. Petitioner, respondent, dissolution of marriage. Across from me, Nathan adjusted the angle of his phone. He wanted the reaction, the tears, the collapse. Evelyn laughed lightly. This is for the best, she said. Truly, my fingers trembled, just slightly, not from heartbreak, from clarity. I finally looked at Nathan. He didn't meet my eyes, not once. That was the moment something inside me stopped trying. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't emotional. This was planned. The smiles, the kindness, the dinner, all of it was a stage, and I had been invited to be humiliated. But I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Instead, I reached for the pen beside my plate. The room seemed to lean forward, waiting. I signed, slowly, carefully, without shaking. The scratch of ink on paper sounded louder than applause ever could. When I finished, I placed the pen neatly on top and pushed the papers back toward Evelyn. Her smile faltered, just for a second. I lifted my glass, took a small sip of wine, and finally spoke. Is that all? Nathan's phone lowered slightly. Wait, he said, confused. Aren't you going to say something? I stood, smoothed my dress, and looked at him for the last time. I already have, I said quietly. For a few seconds after I stood up, no one spoke. Not because they were shocked, but because they were confused. This wasn't how the scene was supposed to go. I was meant to cry, to argue, to ask for mercy. Instead, I stood there calm, steady, holding the silence like it belonged to me. Nathan was the first to break. Lena, he said, forcing a laugh, you don't have to act like this. We can talk. We can ask questions. I looked at him, really looked. The man I had once loved was standing behind a phone, hoping for a reaction dramatic enough to justify what he'd done. And in that moment, I realized something freeing. I didn't owe him anything. I gathered my purse from the back of the chair and slid the signed papers inside. Evelyn's eyes followed my hands closely now. She hadn't expected efficiency. She hadn't expected dignity. She had expected control. I turned toward the table. I just want to say one thing, I said, my voice even. Every head lifted. Nathan straightened. Phone rising again. Hope flickering across his face. I reached into my bag and pulled out a white envelope. This one wasn't lavender. It was thick, crisp, official. I placed it gently on the table beside the divorce papers. This arrived last week, I said. I hadn't planned to share it tonight. Evelyn frowned. Nathan leaned forward. I opened the envelope slowly. It's an offer, I continued. From the Brighton Crown Hotel Group in New York. A ripple passed through the table. I could feel it. Guest experience director, I read. Corporate housing included. Compensation nearly double my current salary. The words didn't shake. They landed hard. Nathan's phone lowered completely now. What? He asked quietly. I smiled, not the polite smile, the real one. Looks like my timing worked out, I said. I start in 3 weeks. Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. You didn't mention this, she said. No, I replied calmly. You didn't ask. The silence that followed was different, not expectant, uneasy. The room had tilted. I gathered the offer letter and slid it back into the envelope. I won't keep everyone, I said. I know this isn't the ending you planned. Nathan stood abruptly. Lena, wait. I raised a hand. He stopped. Not because he respected me, because he didn't recognize me anymore. I turned toward Evelyn. She met my eyes, searching for something. Anger, fear, submission. She found none of it. You taught me something, I said softly. About presentation. About timing. Her jaw tightened. So I wanted to return the favor. I nodded once. Happy birthday to me. As I walked away from the table, something unexpected happened. Someone clapped. Just one person, a server near the back, then another, then another. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Applause rolled slowly through the room like a tide that couldn't be stopped. Nathan's phone slipped from his hand and hit the table with a dull sound. Evelyn stayed seated, her champagne glass trembling slightly. For the first time all evening, she looked small. I didn't turn back. The hallway outside the Magnolia Room felt cooler, quieter, like oxygen after smoke. My heels echoed against the marble floor as I moved through the lobby. Each step felt lighter, cleaner. Outside, the city air hit my face, sharp and alive. I paused at the door, not because I missed them, but because I wanted to remember this feeling. The exact second I stopped being afraid. 2 weeks later, New York greeted me with noise and possibility. The Brighton Crown lobby was all glass and gold, sunlight pouring in like a promise. Welcome aboard, Lena, the general manager said, shaking my hand. We've heard great things. I smiled. So had I. Work gave me structure, purpose, respect. No one here needed my past explained. They cared about how I solved problems, how I handled people, how I showed up, and I did, every day. A month in, I stood behind the front desk, reviewing schedules when the elevator doors opened. I didn't look up at first. Then I heard the voice. We're here for the Whitmore Foundation Conference. I froze. Slowly, I lifted my head. Evelyn Whitmore stood in the lobby. Her posture was perfect. Her smile, uncertain. Our eyes met. Recognition flickered across her face like delayed thunder. I smiled professionally. Welcome to the Brighton Crown, I said. I'll be overseeing your event personally, she swallowed. Of course, she said quietly. I gestured toward the hallway. This way. As she followed me, her heels clicked sharply against the floor. Each sound echoed. Memory answering memory. She spoke once, softly. You've done well, I nodded. Yes, I said. I have. That night, alone in my apartment, my laptop chimed. An email from Nathan. Subject, I'm sorry. I opened it, read it once, then closed it. No reply. Some chapters don't deserve an epilogue. Success doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in slowly, like sunlight filling a room you forgot had windows. That's how my life in New York began to feel. Not dramatic, not rushed, just solid. I learned the rhythm of the Brighton Crown quickly, the flow of guests, the personalities of staff, the small moments where leadership mattered more than authority. People trusted me. That was new. The Whitmore Foundation Conference ran smoothly, flawlessly, actually. Every detail accounted for, every guest satisfied. Evelyn barely spoke to me the entire time. When she did, it was formal, cautious, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing in a place where she had no power. On the final day, she lingered near the ballroom doors after everyone else had left. Lena, she said. I turned. Yes? She hesitated. I didn't expect this, she admitted quietly. I know, I replied. There was nothing unkind in my voice, just truth. 2 weeks later, the story broke. I wasn't the one who shared it. Someone else had leaked the video from my birthday dinner, the one Nathan had recorded so carefully. Only this time, the narrative wasn't what Evelyn had imagined. Headlines followed. Local philanthropy family under fire for public humiliation scandal. Donors reconsider after viral video surfaces. Sponsors withdrew. Board members resigned. The Whitmore Foundation issued a statement. An apology without names, without accountability. I found out the way most people do now, through my phone. I watched the clip once. Muted. I didn't need the sound. I recognized the moment my face stilled. The second my expression changed. The exact frame where power shifted. I closed the video. Some things don't deserve replay. A week later, my supervisor called me into his office. We've been impressed, he said. Your composure, your leadership. He slid a folder across the desk. Promotion. The word felt unreal. I accepted calmly. Later, alone, I let myself breathe. That night, another message arrived. Nathan again. Longer this time. He wrote about mistakes. About pressure, about how he hadn't known who he was becoming. I read every word, then I deleted it. Not out of anger, out of peace. Months passed. One evening, after closing, I sat by the window in my apartment watching the city glow. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for anything. I was just here. The phone rang. Unknown number? I answered. Lena? A voice said softly. Evelyn. I almost didn't respond, but I did. I was wrong, she said. Silence stretched between us. I don't carry anger anymore, I replied, but I won't carry what you did either. She exhaled shakily. I hope you're happy. I smiled faintly. I am. After the call, I stood and opened my closet. The navy dress hung there, wrapped carefully. I touched the fabric. Once, it held humility. humiliation. Now, it held history. I zipped it closed gently. Some things are meant to stay in the past. At an industry conference in Chicago, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned. Nathan. He looked older, smaller. "You look confident," he said. I nodded. I stopped apologizing for existing. He tried to smile. "I lost you," he said quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "You did. Not cruel, just honest." Later that evening, I spoke on a panel about resilience. I didn't name names. I didn't tell the whole story. I spoke about choosing dignity when humiliation feels easier. The room was quiet, listening. When I finished, applause rose. Not loud, but real. As I returned to my seat, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, completion. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand forgiveness. It shows up quietly. One morning when you wake up and realize you're not bracing for the day anymore. That's how I knew I'd crossed the line from survival into peace. A year after the night in the Magnolia Room, I stood in the Brighton Crown Ballroom facing an audience of women from all over the country. Executives, students, mothers, women in transition. I hadn't planned on speaking that night, but someone had asked, "How do you rebuild when your life collapses in public?" The question hung in the air. I stepped forward. "I didn't rebuild," I said honestly. "I chose differently." The room went still. I thought dignity meant staying quiet, staying small, staying agreeable. But dignity isn't silence, it's self-respect. Faces softened. Some nodded, some cried. I told them about loss, about betrayal, about the moment when standing up felt impossible but necessary. I didn't speak about revenge. I spoke about choice. When people try to humiliate you, I said, they're counting on your reaction to justify their behavior. The bravest thing you can do is deny them that satisfaction. Applause followed. Slow, then full. Not because of my story, because it was theirs too. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window. The city lights stretched endlessly below me. I thought about who I used to be, the woman who measured herself through approval, who mistook endurance for love, who thought leaving meant failing. I smiled softly. Leaving had saved me. A few weeks later, I took a weekend trip south, back to Charleston. The ocean greeted me with familiar calm, waves rolling in without urgency or demand. I walked barefoot along the shoreline, the hem of my dress brushing salt water, each step erased by the tide. It felt symbolic. Some footprints aren't meant to last. That evening, as the sun dipped low, my phone buzzed, a message, unknown number. I didn't open it. Some doors don't need reopening to prove they're closed. When I returned to New York, something unexpected waited for me. A promotion. Assistant Operations Director. I stared at the email longer than I expected, not because I doubted myself, because I remembered when others had. I accepted, not with excitement, with certainty. On my first day in the new role, I passed a mirror in the lobby. I stopped. The woman looking back at me stood tall, grounded, present. She didn't look like someone who had won. She looked like someone who had chosen herself. That night, I opened my closet again. The navy dress still hung there. I didn't take it down this time. I simply smiled and closed the door. I no longer needed reminders of who I had survived. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how things ended. I don't, because endings are only painful when you believe you're losing something. I wasn't. I was being released. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this. No one gets to decide your worth in public or private. No signature defines your value. No silence means consent. And sometimes the cruelest gift life hands you is actually an invitation to begin again on your terms. I didn't walk away from my life that night. I walked into it. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, or felt small in rooms that never deserved you, you're not alone. Subscribe for more real stories about resilience, self-worth, and choosing yourself, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away with your dignity intact.